food's relationship to every single aspect of public health. Marion helps map the shift in the industrial diet, and she debunks these mainstream notions of personal responsibility in health. I really enjoyed speaking with her, and I have to admit, I came in a little intimidated. So I hope you guys enjoy all of the spunk and energy that is Marion Nestle. Good morning. How you doing?
All right.
Yeah, where are you zooming in from?
Ithaca, New York.
Oh, nice. I went to college in Poughkeepsie, so
Oh, you
that's
did.
as far north as I've gone, but is it cold there or what's the weather like?
Oh, today's beautiful. It's in the 70s. It's
Oh,
really nice.
nice.
It's really nice.
I'm on the island of Oahu in Hawaii.
Also sounds very nice.
Yeah, it is nice. I mean, it's home, so like everywhere, home is home, and you sort of get locked into your life and you forget like, oh, I'm on a magical paradise island and I need to be more grateful.
Right.
I'm so grateful you agreed to do this. Thank you so much. I'm just waiting for my colleague Julia to join, but in the meantime, I'd love to give you just a little bit of the origin story of the podcast. So you kind of know what you're getting into. So I'm assuming you're familiar with the Center for Food Safety.
Oh, yeah.
And Andrew Kimbrell, my boss, really wanted me to create a podcast that helps share the story of the industrial food system and the massive global movement that's arisen to challenge that system. And I really felt like the best way to tell that story was through the eyes and the hearts of the people that have been working to raise awareness about what the industrial food system is, how it's shaped our lives, how it's shaped our plates. And I'm particularly interested in kind of the how of efficacy, like how do we maintain hope when it feels like things are impossible, and like what are what inspires folks to keep working, and like what are their aha moments and what supported them through their journey. So I think for you, as sort of one of the fairy godmothers of the food movement in the United States, like providing us that sort of historical context, like how the food movement arose and sort of what it's meant for you to be involved in national food politics, which for me feels like the most alienating. And then anything else on your personal journey that's shifted you. You know, we've interviewed quite a few folks that have talked about the way certain landscapes have inspired them. And, you know, they go out, and we had one environmental litigator talk about fly fishing in Montana and how it's really shaped him and restored him as he's tried to battle the likes of Monsanto and Bayer. But it's mostly about you, your journey into activism. So I'd love to start today by just asking a little bit about where you're from, like where you were raised, sort of what shaped you as a young Marion Nestle?
Well, it's interesting that you're asking questions about the young Marion Nestle, because I've just written a memoir.
Oh, nice.
And the memoir comes out in October.
Really?
As I like to put it, it's my first. I typically write nonfiction, so the memoir is a sharp departure. I don't know how fictionalized it is. It's my version of what happened. So probably everything that you're going to ask me about my background is covered in this book.
Great. And this will be like a part of the promo tour.
That'll even be better because it comes out October 4th, according to
great.
So yeah, it was a sharp departure to write about it. And I wrote the book For exactly this reason, to answer the questions that I'm always asked about how I got started, how I got interested in food, how I got interested in food politics, and the whole nine yards. That's what the book is about.
So, but can you give us a little bit of a sneak peek?
Well, yes, I got interested in food because I love to eat.
Yeah.
I think food is one of life's greatest pleasures, and how to go about studying it was something that interested me right from the beginning. I went to college wanting to study about food, but the only options at the time were agriculture, and I'm a city girl. I didn't get the whole agriculture thing until much later. And dietetics, I started out at Berkeley as a dietetics major. I lasted exactly one day and thought this isn't going to work. And it took me a very, very long time to come back to it. But I finally did when I was given a nutrition class to teach. And my first teaching job at Brandeis University in 1975, I was given a nutrition class to teach, and I've never looked back.
So, what was the moment when you realized that nutrition told a much bigger story than just macronutrients or calories and weight gain?
Well, it actually happened on the first day I started preparing the class. A story that I've told many, many times. I didn't know anything about nutrition, but I was assigned a nutrition class to teach. And I was interested in it, so I was happy to do whatever research was necessary. My department believed that if you had a doctorate, and mine is in molecular biology, but if you had a doctorate, then you ought to be able to teach anything that undergraduates needed to know about biology. And so I was set loose on nutrition. And on the first day I started preparing the class, I opened up a bunch of nutrition textbooks to the page about what was required in the human diet. And the lists didn't agree. Some books listed one set of nutrients, some books listed another. I thought it was pretty incredible that there was not common agreement about what nutrients were required in the diet. I went to the library and started reading and immediately discovered what the status of nutrition research was like in 1975. And the study that I opened it up to was a study of the vitamin thiamine. And investigators had gone into a mental hospital in the South and put a bunch of inmates on a thiamine deficient diet, and then looked to see what their behavior changes were. And one of their assays was whether the women were willing to do chores around the hospital. And I was hooked for life.
So what happens when you're thiamine deficient?
Well, you have very bad personality disorders and you're mentally ill. These women were in a mental institution. And I immediately went to another study for vitamin C. And that one was done on 6 prisoners in a penitentiary. And during the study, 2 of the prisoners escaped. That was not a well-controlled clinical trial. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a magical way to teach undergraduate biology, because students will be able to read these studies and see what's wrong with them and start critical thinking about biology and about nutrition. And I never looked back. I started the textbooks that I used in my first class. I used Frances Moore Lappé's Diet for Small Money, which she'd just written, and which has just come out in its 50th anniversary edition. Center for Science and the Public Interest had just been started, and they had a book called Food for People, Not for Profit that could have been written yesterday because the issues haven't changed. And it was a collection of short articles about food system issues. They didn't call it food system, but there it was. That was what it was. And there were other kinds of things too. And so it was critical thinking in biology. And it was obvious right from the beginning that what people ate was enormously influenced by marketing, by advertising, by whatever the science was, and then by politics. I mean, it was just all there right from the beginning. I loved it.
I'm having this moment right now where I'm realizing that one of the studies I read in my PhD process was about a prisoner experiment where they deliberately starved these prisoners and like tracked their dietary shifts.
That's a very famous study. That's Ansel Keys' starvation study.
And I'm like, what? We need to do a whole podcast episode on the mistreatment of the incarcerated in the United States. So
these people were volunteers. The people in that study volunteered because they were conscientious objectors in World War II. So they volunteered for it. And what came out of that study was really remarkable. So that's different from incarcerated prisoners.
I got it.
If that's the study that you're talking about.
Right. So
you
mentioned that diet and nutrition and sort of the public perceptions of health are heavily influenced by industry. I'm wondering if you can kind of break that down a little bit for us.
Oh, absolutely. First of all, you're not supposed to notice it. So when I wrote my book, Food Politics, in 2002, it came as a big shock to a lot of people. They hadn't realized that advertising is supposed to influence what you buy. I mean, it's hard to talk about it with a straight face, but if advertising is working the way it's supposed to work, you're not supposed to notice it. The way it was explained to me is it's supposed to slip below the radar of critical thinking. Mm-hmm. You're just supposed to respond to it emotionally. And food companies, as I'm extremely fond of saying, are not social service agencies. They're not public health agencies. They're businesses. And their job is to satisfy their stockholders' demands for profits. And once you understand that, I mean, once that gets into your thinking, everything changes about your perception of the way the food environment looks. And you understand a lot more about what's going on in the food system. They're trying to sell food. That's all they're doing. And they're trying to sell food under circumstances that are very difficult because we have twice as much food in the American food supply as is needed by the population. So there's this huge overabundance of food. We can talk about how it got that way, but that's how it is. And if you're a food company trying to sell food, in that environment, you're up against a really tough barrier because there's too much food. People could only eat so much. So you try to devise cleverer and cleverer and cleverer and more subtle ways of selling food to people. So they'll buy more of your product, buy more in general. And unfortunately, the buying more in general, I think, is what led to consumption of more calories, weight gain, and all of the diseases that go with too much weight gain.
Because I'm realizing, your career spans the full emergence of the obesity epidemic in the United States. It certainly does. Mm. So how did that feel for you as a scholar and a thinker to observe these trends and realize that there was also sort of a consensus at the governmental level around some of the diets that were exacerbating these trends?
Oh, I'm not sure the government advice about diet had anything to do with it. I think it's marketing. And the reason that I think that is because there was a big shift in public policy in 1980 when President Reagan was elected. And he came in on an anti-regulatory agenda and a pro-industry agenda. And a lot of things changed after that. It became easier to market foods. You could market to children. There were more calories in the food supply. It was And the investment system changed. There's a new book out by David Gillis about Jack Welch, who was the head of General Electric, who in 1981 made a speech that corporations should forget about blue chip stocks, forget about long-term secure returns on investment. You want immediate higher returns on investment right now. To satisfy stockholders, and Wall Street bought that hook, line, and sinker. And the result was enormous pressure to sell, to grow. It wasn't enough that companies needed to make a profit. They had to grow their profits and report growth to Wall Street every 90 days. For food companies, this was impossible because they were already trying to sell food in an environment in which there were twice as many calories available in the food supply as the population needed. We have 4,000 calories available in the American food supply for every man, woman, and little tiny baby in the country. And we have for years. And that's twice what the population needs. So how do you sell food in that environment? You have to work hard to do it. And they're really good at it. And they have all these people that they hire to teach them how to market and to take advantage of our human way of relating to objects and things and emotions, and take advantage of that. And they're really good at it.
So as you're sort of developing this interest at Brandeis, teaching undergraduates and realizing that this was a great sort of sector with which to understand some of these larger trends within capitalism, can you tell us a little bit about how your career and your teaching evolved as there was more attention to food as a site for scholarship and research and activism?
Well, there was already a lot in 1975. You just don't realize it because you weren't involved in it. I mean, it's still a lot of it was focused on vitamins and minerals, nutrients. But so the evolution that I see is the evolution towards food politics. And my book, Food Politics, marked an inflection point there. I mean, that wasn't how I intended it. I intended that book as describing what seemed to me to be the obvious. I was just describing what I was seeing, but it came as a big shock to people. And there really weren't very many other people outside of Center for Science of the Public Interest who were interested in the interaction of food and politics and what was going on. And we're looking at these kinds of questions as social phenomenon or economic phenomenon rather than personal responsibility phenomenon. So that when I look at weight gain, I see the forces that went into encouraging Americans to eat more calories. And there's tons of evidence that the average calorie intake of the population went up between 1980 and 2000 by about 500 calories a day. Okay, 300 to 500, but certainly enough to account for the average 10 to 20 pound weight gain over that 20-year period. And that has continued to rise. And we now have enormous amounts of evidence about the kinds of foods that people were eating that encourage people to eat more than they think they're eating. This is this new concept of ultra processed foods, which I think is the most important new concept that's come in nutrition in decades, a defining of a class of junk foods that's industrially produced and has the property of encouraging people to eat more than they think they're eating, than they intended to eat, and that they need, and they're gaining weight as a result. It's no surprise. There's tons of evidence to support that. Whether you look at this as being these foods are addictive, or as Michael Moss says in his work, Salt, Sugar, Fat, his book, and his subsequent book, where he talks about the addictive properties of what we now call ultra-processed foods. We know from a controlled clinical trial done at NIH that when people are eating these things, they eat more and don't know it. And they don't know why they're eating more. And it's been hard to figure out why they eat more, but that's what they're doing. So the observation is that as the more and more and more of these junk foods got into the food supply and became normalized through marketing, so it's assumed that you're going to drink sodas all day long. It's assumed that you're going to go to fast food restaurants. It's assumed that fast food is going to be sold in schools and colleges and universities and institutions. I mean, this is normal. As these foods became normalized, people ate more calories from them and gained weight, big surprise. And I think the COVID pandemic made it clear that that high levels of overweight are not healthy for people. They increase your risk for a whole bunch of things, including a bad outcome from COVID-19.
So your theory is less the transition of the American diet towards sort of low fat, high carb.
No.
That wasn't the sort of driving force of the obesity epidemic. It was rather just the selling of more food with fewer nutrients, but higher calories.
I don't even know about the fewer nutrients. I think foods have plenty of nutrients. Nutrients aren't the issues. Calories are the issue. And I know that not everybody believes that. There are people who believe very strongly that it matters whether it's carbohydrate calories or fat calories. I don't think so. I think we have plenty of evidence that calorie consumption increased during that period, that it rose in parallel with obesity. And by this time, people are so accustomed to eating more calories that they're still gaining weight.
Yeah, I remember I was in undergrad when your book came out, and I decided to do my PhD on food politics. I was interested in global social movements that were sort of rising up around the industrial food system. How did the publication and sort of like the massive popularity of a text that was fairly academic, how did that shift you as in your life trajectory? Like,
we're back in the memoir again.
Yeah, we are.
That chapter is titled "The Fun Begins."
Hey.
I was surprised. I was first surprised by the initial reactions to the book. There were some absolutely horrendous reviews published on Amazon. Absolutely horrendous. I mean, they just couldn't have been nastier. And then it turned out, of course, that somebody had paid for them, and they were, but they're still there. You can go to the Food Politics website on Amazon, and if you look back through all the comments on it,
we'll make sure to link those in the show notes.
They're the first ones, and I have them posted on my website. They're kind of amazing. It was the sort of thing where really obesity is about personal responsibility, was what the argument was. And if you're fat, it's your fault. And I think it's much more complicated than that. And, they were pretty upset that I was blaming the change in the food environment on the food industry. And I do blame the change in the food environment on the food industry, not because the food industry is evil, it's just doing its job as set by Wall Street. And every now and then you hear from the World Economic Forum or business groups that really Wall Street ought to evaluate corporations on social responsibility as well as fiduciary responsibility, but nothing ever happens along those lines. This is about business and profit, and it's profiting off public health. And I think that's very unfortunate, and that's what I keep talking about.
But I want to get back to the fun. So the fun begins.
Well, I had reasons for writing Food Politics. I didn't think anybody was talking about those issues, and I was particularly upset about going to meetings, conferences about childhood obesity, and having one speaker after another get up and say, how are we going to educate moms to feed their children better? It just made me furious. I thought it was so missing the point and blaming the victim and, so just not really understanding what was going on. So that was one reason, was sort of refocusing that debate. And then I was particularly annoyed by industry sponsorship of nutrition education, and what was then the American Dietetic Association, now the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, had fact sheets in its newsletter that were sponsored by companies, and you could predict what the fact sheet said if you knew who the sponsor was. If it was a supplement company, then you knew that the fact sheet was going to say that supplements were really good for health. If it was Monsanto, you knew that they were going to say that genetically modified foods were good for health, and so forth. So I wanted them to stop doing those fact sheets, which they eventually did. And then the third one was a personal one. I wanted better speaking invitations. I was getting a lot of speaking invitations, but they weren't paid and they were to very small audiences. And I really wanted to try to have a better reach. And you have to be careful what you ask for. So in the 3 years after Food Politics came out, I was doing 85 talks a year, while running a teaching load, while chairing an academic nutrition department, while doing all these other things. It just about killed me. And then finally, I had to cut back on that. But in fact, the conference has changed. And now, any conference that you go to on weight gain and obesity is going to be talking about the social, environmental, and economic factors. They've become a very big issue. And I think that's an enormously important change. And eventually the Dietetic Association stopped doing those things. So I guess some good came out of it.
Knowing that the food industry and the pesticide industry are particularly nefarious in their tactics for shooting the messenger, and having you sort of share your negative paid Amazon reviews, like, what was the blowback of this sort of campaign you were on to shift the focus away from obesity as personal responsibility failure towards the effects of deliberate industry strategy to sell more calories?
Well, the blowback in my case was not personal, or it was very rarely personal. I was threatened with one lawsuit. I mean, it was a particularly funny one, and I still laugh about it. But I never heard about it again. And I don't get confrontations from food companies. Occasionally, somebody will say, I met someone quite recently, actually this year, who said that when Food Politics came out, he was hired by a food company to track everything that I was doing and suggest to that company how they could counter the messages that I was saying. But I didn't know anything about that. I mean, it was really outside of my radar. I think in general, and that was the situation. I mean, because I don't take money from food companies, because I had an academic position with tenure, I was pretty untouchable. And I wasn't subject to a lot of personal attacks. What did happen was they followed the tobacco industry's playbook to the letter. They casted doubt on the science. They said the science wasn't ready. They blamed personal responsibility. They went through the whole 9 yards on that. And they're still doing it. Although every now and then there's a realization from companies, particularly the soda companies were hit particularly hard because they contain sugars and water and nothing else, and nothing of nutritional value. All of the other junk foods have some nutritional value, but the sugar-sweetened beverages don't. And so the soda companies were in trouble on public health grounds, and they've done what they can. But mostly they've tried reformulating, and they're selling bottled water, and they're doing other things. I'm doing a new edition of my book, What to Eat, that came out in 2006. And one of the enormous changes that's taken place is the substitution of bottled water, calorie-free bottled water, for sugar-sweetened beverages. It's pretty astonishing how big that change has been. And, I consider that a win.
Minus the plastic pollution, I'm sure.
Minus the plastic pollution. Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah. So, was there ever a moment? I mean, first, I want to know if there was ever a moment where you felt like you lost hope. And then I'm also wondering, as you shifted towards an advisor to sort of national food policy and started to engage more directly in the government, like what that pulled out from you, because that's taking your academic work and really transitioning it into advocacy.
Well, I should say that one of the effects of food politics was that I was never invited on a federal committee again afterwards.
Congratulations.
So I've been completely excluded from, I was on a few federal advisory committees prior to that, a couple for the FDA Food Advisory Committee and its Science Board. And then I was on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee in 1995. But once food politics came out, I was considered, and I was told this, I was considered way too controversial. And I was considered biased.
Okay, good.
I was considered biased, way too biased to be on a federal advisory committee. But apparently people who think that what the food industry is doing is terrific are not considered biased. So that's one of the, so I don't think I have much influence on federal policy except in, some sort of distant way. And I certainly don't see it. Occasionally I will hear from somebody off the record, that they spent a day arguing about some issue that I raised, but I'm not in any direct position. I'm not involved in the White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, and Health that's coming up in the fall. I'm not involved in any of that stuff. It's too controversial. So I write articles that are even more controversial. Might as well.
So what are those articles? Tell us what you're working on right now, other than the memoir, which we're very excited about.
Well, the memoir and the updated edition of What to Eat. I just published an article in the American Journal of Public Health called Regulating the Food Industry and Aspirational Agenda. That just came out. And I've just submitted an article to another journal on essentially what to do about calories. And we'll see whether I haven't gotten any feedback on that yet, so I don't know what's going to happen with it.
And so the governing thesis of this work just continues to hammer home, like as long as we're marketing more calories to Americans, we're going to see the negative health impacts of obesity and the related chronic health issues.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the article in the American Journal of Public Health argues for very tight regulation of ultra-processed foods, stopping marketing to children, subsidies for fruits and vegetables, not corn and soybeans. That's why it's an aspirational agenda. The probability of getting it is pretty small. But as you asked about hope, as I argue in that article, aspirational agendas are very useful because they set benchmarks. They set an agenda. They give you something to work toward. And when the time is right, you're ready. You're ready to act. And sometimes you get them if you're lucky.
When we think about, I think about some of the policies that have come to Hawaii around this agenda. Like we had a sugary sweetened beverage ban on school campuses that went through the legislature. And what was most disheartening for me were these like quasi-medical associations testifying against the bill, which you understood were these sort of fake shops set up by the industry to kind of obfuscate the science. How do you encourage folks to get involved in sort of pursuing the actualization of this aspirational agenda?
Well, I taught courses in food advocacy. How you go about doing that. I mean, it turns out there are rules for advocates in general, and food advocates in particular. There are very, very good books available on how to do this.
Give us a few titles.
Well, um, what's Bite Back? I think the last chapter of Bite Back is a very short guide to how to do advocacy, and it's a summary of a much larger book. I can't remember the name of the much larger book, but that chapter alone is worth the price of admission. That's a book published by University of California Press, with Saru Jayaraman as one of the editors, where they have paired articles about issues and how advocates dealt with those issues. Very, very useful. And then this last chapter is a guide on how to do it. And, I use the Berkeley soda tax as the prototypical example of how to do advocacy by the book and have it work. And if you remember, the Berkeley soda tax passed with a vote of 76%. When was the last time you heard about an election in America that had a vote of 76%? And they did that through classic community organizing. They did door-to-door community organizing, talking to people about what was their understanding of the relationship of sugary drinks? Did they have to disease? Did they have people in their family with type 2 diabetes? Everybody did. There were several talking points, and then a lot of it had to do with how the soda industry was trying to market sodas as benign, and we're not trying to get you to drink too much, and a little isn't going to hurt you, and this kind of thing. And of course, the soda industry sunk millions into trying to fight it, but they were able, and they were also able to demonstrate that. So they were able to show how the soda industry was behaving in that situation, and the vote came through. And of course, okay, it's Berkeley. So
I wasn't going to say that, but I'm glad you did.
It's Berkeley. Okay, it's Berkeley. But the city council said that they would use the proceeds from the soda tax to fund child health initiatives, and the people in that town trusted the city council to do what it said it was going to do, and it did do what it said it was going to do. So that's been kind of a really good example of advocacy that works. And I wrote about it at length in my book, Soda Politics, which came out in 2015.
There's something that strikes me in my own personal experience is how important classic community organizing remains in policy change. And I think with the rise of social media, we think we can kind of hit clicktivism, I think they call it, where they think you can sort of share a bunch of posts and that's how change is going to happen. But you actually need that personal one-on-one interaction to affect change. I mean, I saw that in my own experience, and that's what I'm hearing in the story about the Berkeley soda tax is people.
I don't think there's any question about it. There really isn't any question that if you want, you have to have a personal interaction with the people that you're talking to. You have to meet them where they are and talk about why the change is needed and what effect it's going to have in their own lives. And the Berkeley example was nobody wants to be taxed. And so to pass a tax with a vote of 76% is a real tribute to the organizers of that effort, who I have to say were a group of people largely of color, who were really concerned about the effects of sugar-sweetened beverages on their families and friends and neighbors. And that emotional connection really resonated with residents. of that community, and that's happened in other places as well. But I know from classic public health, I have a master's in public health, that this is what they teach you in public health school, but hardly anybody does it because community organizing is hard and it takes a very long time.
Yep. Yeah, I can't disagree with you there. And by proxy, it's at times expensive and confusing and subject to the whims of humanity, personality and division. And
yeah, but I mean, what you don't want is you don't want white people going into communities of people of color and telling them what to do. It's you can't do that anymore. It doesn't work.
yep, I don't know if it ever did, but
It may never have worked, right?
so tell us what's giving you hope right now. I mean, how has the landscape shifted? You mentioned sort of the substitution of water for sugary sweetened beverages. How has the landscape shifted, and sort of what are you driving towards when it comes to the change you're looking to see?
Well, the ideal diet is so simple that the journalist Michael Pollan can summarize it in 7 words: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Really, that's all there is to it. And within those 7 words, you can have delicious food. You really can. What you can't do is eat a lot of junk food. Or what we're now calling ultra processed foods, a specific category of junk foods that you can't make in your home kitchen is the easiest way to explain it, because it's got ingredients that you can't buy in supermarkets. And you know what they are. You look at any ingredient list, you can spot one in a minute. So you want people eating real food. And eating more healthfully means eating real food. It means not overeating, and it means making sure that you have lots of plant foods and eat your fruits and veggies. And if you are eating that way, the probability of your overeating is much less, because it's pretty hard to gorge on a salad. Most people can't do it, whereas it's very easy to gorge on fast food or ultra processed snack foods and these kinds of things. The famous potato chip advertisement, "You can't eat just one," is the perfect way of describing what this is about. No, you couldn't eat just one. And that's why people ate a lot of potato chips, which was just what the potato chips marketers wanted. Again, not because food companies are sitting around a conference table saying, how can we make Americans fat? They're sitting around a conference table saying, how are we going to sell our product in this extremely competitive food environment?
Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about Raj Patel's book, Stuffed and Starved. And I'm wondering sort of how you've addressed the issues of childhood malnutrition that are emerging in the United States, because kids, particularly low-income kids, don't have access anymore to fresh fruits and vegetables.
Well, this is a policy issue. We have the current food policy in the United States puts all of its money into corn, soybeans, and other such commodity crops. And these are, some astonishing percentage of these crops goes to feed animals, or these days it goes to fuel automobiles. It's made into alcohol. I mean, something that I cannot get my head around. I mean, it makes so little sense to me. So our food system isn't set up to promote healthy food for people. It's set up to promote food for animals and fuel for cars. Well, that needs to change. And the question is, how do we go about changing that? That is very difficult. Hence aspirational, my aspirational agenda. I don't think it's easy. We have a particularly difficult political situation right now, one that I've never seen anything like in my very long lifetime, where the country is polarized in ways that are completely unexpected, or at least unexpected by me. And Washington is politically stuck. you can't do anything. But I mean, politics just doesn't work. It's totally corrupted. It's sold out to industry. Corporations run the country. Corporations run the Supreme Court. Corporations run everything. And how you change that is something that's very hard to contemplate because we have no experience in changing that. You know, what caused the change the last time, which was in the 1930s, when there was a big change, was when there was a depression that was so severe that, you know, people were dying on the streets and nobody had any money to buy anything. And that went on for years until the Second World War. But during that period, we had a president who was able to get through measures that reduced inequality to some extent and put in place a lot of programs that still exist. That presumably that could happen again. It seems unlikely at the moment, but it could happen again if there was enough of a political will. So the question is, how do you get enough of a political will? How bad does it have to get before things change? I mean, that's the question we're all asking about gun control right now, or gun safety, as I understand the words we're supposed to be using. You know, how bad does it have to get before the country rises up and says we must do something to control the use of guns in this country, or to have safer use of firearms?
Something I've been thinking a lot about is, you know, as we grapple with federal entrenchment, shifting politics to the city, county, and state level to kind of carve out better, maybe more progressive policy bubbles. And knowing that there are a lot of unleveraged federal funds in states that might grow the diversified agricultural sector. I mean, it's like folks just haven't really figured out how to bring down those dollars, at least here in Hawaii. Are there sort of regional food systems or local food systems and sort of like a political apparatus around them that are inspiring you?
Well, I'm certainly inspired by the number of people who are trying to create exactly that. And certainly there are places where, you know, farmers markets are all over the place and farmers are making a living, small farmers are making a living. The Biden administration has just come out with a new framework for agriculture that has quite a bit of support for organic agriculture, which I think is a good thing, and some things buried in there that I think will work for small and medium-sized farmers. But if we really want to change the agricultural system, which I think is essential. I finally caught on to agriculture. You know, it's essential. It's essential to change the agricultural system. You know, I know when Tom Vilsack became Secretary of Agriculture the first time, I heard a very inspiring speech that he gave about wanting to revitalize and repopulate rural America. And I found this very inspiring because rural America requires repopulating and revitalization. You go through rural America, it's all boarded up. There are no schools, there are no hospitals, there are no institutions, there's no people there. And there are no people there because enormous corporate food producers have bought up all the land, and they don't live in those places. They just, you know, industrially farm them. And I don't even think that farm is the right word. Industrially mine them, an extractive industry that pollutes the water supplies, that loses soil, that does all kinds of things that make agriculture quite unsustainable, I think. That has to change. And one way to change it is by offering some of that land to farmers. I know lots of people who want to farm, but they can't afford to buy the land. There are policies that you can think of that would be very simple, that would open up some of that. And there were traces of that in Vilsack's framework. The message is getting across. It's just very hard to know how to get started on it and get going on it. Especially in a government that's divided. where the president is, where the president has a majority in Congress that is so slim that anybody who sneezes messes it up.
I know. I wonder too. I mean, I think about some of the community organizing that I've done and how I've always been sort of shocked at the conservative politics of the agricultural sector. Mm-hmm. And yet there's been this sort of new kind of meeting and alignment around shared visions where progressives are looking to invest in agriculture in ways that disarms the agricultural sector sometimes. Not massive agribusiness like Monsanto, Bayer, et cetera, but even sort of the small scale cattle industry here in Hawaii is relatively conservative. And yet you see environmentalists wanting to team around soil health, for example, and rotational grazing. So I wonder if food might be a space where we can continue to do bipartisan policy change if we can build the relationships there to kind of hold that bipartisan connection intact.
I think that's true. I recently watched a set of films done by people at the University of Arizona, where they're doing actual experiments where they have areas of land throughout the country that they're farming using regenerative methods. This is where you keep the cattle grazing in very small areas and you move them around so that the grass grows back and the cattle fertilize and it's quite productive, and you can get them off of agricultural inputs, and you can do a lot of things. And one of the things that they were trying to do with these films or with this project was to encourage other farmers in the areas around these experimental farms to adopt the same kind of practices. And they one of the things I liked about the film so much was how respectful and admiring they were of traditional farmers and the reasons why they didn't want to change. So it was not adversarial at all. It was, we're part of the same community. We want everybody in the community to flourish. And after a while, and years in some cases, there were farmers who decided they wanted to try to change the practices. And so it was working. It wasn't working quickly, but it was working, and it was working very effectively. And it made me think that this was a very, very good approach that does exactly what you just suggested, which is using food as a way to build alliances in community rather than to divide people.
So as you sort of look forward, in this next chapter, maybe post-memoir, what are you looking to work on, and what are you looking to draw people into in your work and your advocacy?
Well, as I said, I'm doing a revised edition of What to Eat, which was my supermarket book. I used the structure of supermarkets as an organizing device to talk about food issues. And that book came out in 2006, so that's 16 years ago. And I greatly underestimated how much it changed. I'm laughing because I've just extended my turn-in date on the manuscript by quite a long time because there was no way in the world I could finish it. And the changes that I've observed are, we've already talked about one, the substitution of bottled water, flavored waters mainly, for sugar-sweetened beverages. I think a very good change. Another enormous change is the introduction of plant-based products. Those are a mixed blessing. I'm not sure, whether I love them or don't love them, but I certainly will talk about them in this book. And of course, the other two overriding issues that govern everything that the book is going to have to talk about are what's happened with climate change and what's happened with inequality. And so those two issues, which 15 years ago were not nearly as prominent, are now overwhelming and cannot be ignored. So that in every situation, price is an issue. In every section of the supermarket, and also the supermarket landscape, where I'm analyzing supermarkets in high income areas and low income areas to try to see what the differences are. If you want a lot of organic foods, you don't go to Harlem to get a lot of organic foods, except in Whole Foods, which to my enormous surprise is no different than the Whole Foods in my neighborhood in downtown New York. Has the same prices and the same foods and a very, very different customer population. So those issues which I didn't have to deal with 15 years ago are now just screaming for attention. Where do people buy food? What do people do if they have food stamps? Who makes it easy for food stamp users? Who makes it difficult? Why do food stamp users go to Walmart and not to not to Trader Joe's? Is it a question of price? Is it a question of class? Is it a question of not feeling welcome? I mean, so those kinds of things which I didn't have to deal with, I really have to deal with on this round. And they're very, very interesting. So I'm having a lot of fun with this.
Yeah, I'm curious too, like the emergence of some of these dash-free diets has shifted people's consciousness, like the fad of gluten-free, as a Crohn's or gluten intolerant dietary choice. Goes along with plant-based and vegan. I mean, these sort of diets that are about a specific what to eat and not necessarily, like you said, analyzing the calories in what you're eating. I mean, a gluten-free baked good is still
it still has calories.
Yeah.
It still has calories. Well, I mean, these kinds of fads are, I don't want to be too characterizing about it, but these are young, healthy women, white and largely white women, young, healthy white women. These are their concerns, the yoga crowd. And that's a big population and they're an influential population. And it's worth looking at these products, and I'm looking at them. I think some of them I find extremely entertaining. I just sit there and laugh. I think, you've got to be kidding me. Somebody would actually buy this? Well, yeah, somebody would. But that's belief systems, not science.
What do you think the wish is when people try to sort of buy their way to health? Like, how did we get there when we started to think, well, maybe if I buy this certain kind of food, I'll be healthy, rather than...
Yeah, I think of it as magical thinking. It's magical thinking. And the population of people who use these products are probably the healthiest in the country. I mean, they start out being healthy, and there's an obsession around food details, which I think is unfortunate. But I don't think it's very harmful. I mean, it's not what I think are the really important food issues. I think the really important food issues are not having enough food, and eating so much that you're putting on weight that you really shouldn't be putting on. And it's, those are tough ones. And I see them as very different problems. One is a policy problem. The other is a policy problem too, but it's a different kind of policy problem. And because the issue of not having enough food is so much more pressing and demanding and so much more awful to think about. Kids not having enough food. Oh, come on. In this country, I just can't even bear to think about it. You want to solve that one first. And that's hard enough to solve. And the easy way to solve it is to make sure people have enough money. When the Biden administration gave people who were on SNAP and, more benefits, and gave people financial benefits and gave them payments. Guess what? Hunger went down. What a surprise. Should surprise nobody.
Right. So as we kind of close out, I'm wondering if you have advice for folks that are getting active around food and sort of bumping up against some of the complexity and confusion that the food industry creates around what we need to do right now. Like, what's your sort of guidance for them as they work on this journey?
Well, I would say know what you're talking about. To start with, you really have to know what you're talking about. You have to do the research. You have to be very, very clear on what your facts are, what the problem is that you're trying to solve, who is capable of solving the problem, who your allies are, how you get allies into helping you solve this problem. That's classic program
power
advocacy.
mapping.
Yeah, that's what you do. You have to do that. If you go through those steps, you have a much, much better chance of getting what you're aiming for. And you work with as many people as you can to try to get that. So that's one thing. And you have to know your enemy. You have to know what you're up against, and be willing and able to come back with fact-based responses. That means knowing a lot of facts. Not so easy to do. I think people underestimate the complexity of nutrition, the complexity of food issues, greatly, greatly underestimate how difficult and complicated they are and how many factors go into it. You have to understand that people are human, and that knowledge is not sufficient to change behavior. People have to want to change behavior in order to change, and that takes some doing. They have to know enough to do that. They have to understand why it's better for them. And then just to understand that politics is involved in everything that we eat, everything. And that if you want to change the way people eat and get people to eat healthier, you've got to change the politics. That's a tough job.
Yeah, I think it brings us back to that, like, we got to return to classic community organizing and kind of building the real relationships and understandings that are necessary to drive change perceptions, drive change behavior, and ultimately drive different policies.
And hard to do when you've got a food industry that's spending billions of dollars to convince people to buy their products.
So last question, what's giving you hope?
Oh, I teach students. There are so many young people who are interested in these questions. When I started out doing this kind of thing, I was in a department of nutrition and home economics, and now it's food studies. And when we started food studies at New York University, it was the only food studies program in the country. And now there's 50 or 60 of them throughout the world. And, every university is teaching about food. Every department is teaching about food. Everybody is interested in food. And I think the understanding about how food relates to society, culture, identity, individuality, personal choice, health, the environment, that understanding is becoming so widespread in the population. That's a huge change from 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, well, I know as a student, I was really inspired by your work. So I'm grateful that you're still writing, you're still fighting, you're still teaching, and you're giving us the facts we need to do the advocacy that we want to do.
Yeah, get out there and do it.
Thank you so much for your time today, Marion. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.